In a quiet village shrouded in whispers and secrets, an old man's cunning mind wove a web of deceit that turned neighbor against neighbor. What began as a simple rumor about hidden treasure spiraled into chaos, betrayal, and loss. But was the treasure ever real? Or was it all a ploy to exploit the greed and mistrust of the villagers? In this tale of psychological horror, you'll uncover the chilling truth behind the old man's schemes and the darkness that lurks in the hearts of those who sought his treasure. Don't forget to subscribe, repent, and hit the like button. Your support helps us bring more spine-tingling stories to life. And remember, let's begin. The village of Black Hollow was a place where time seemed to stand still. Nestled between dense forests and jagged hills, it was a world of its own, untouched by the chaos of the outside. The villagers were simple folk farmers, blacksmiths, and shepherds who lived by the rhythm of the seasons. But beneath the surface of their mundane lives, there was a quiet unease, a tension that no one dared to speak of. At the heart of the village stood a crumbling cottage, its roof sagging under the weight of years. This was the home of Elias Thorne, an old man whose name was spoken in hushed tones. He was a figure of mystery, a man who seemed to know too much and say too little. His frail frame and trembling hands gave the impression of harmlessness, but his piercing blue eyes told a different story. They were the eyes of a predator, always watching, always calculating. Elias had lived in Black Hollow for as long as anyone could remember, yet no one truly knew him. He rarely left his cottage, and when he did, it was only to wander the forest or sit by the village well, muttering to himself. The villagers tolerated him, partly out of pity and partly out of fear. For Elias had a reputation for wisdom, for knowing things he shouldn't, and for a treasure that no one had ever seen. It started with a rumor. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the village square filled with the chatter of weary laborers, Elias emerged from the shadows. He leaned heavily on his cane, his voice trembling but clear. "They're coming," he said, his eyes darting around the square. "They're coming for my treasure." The villagers froze. Treasure? What treasure? Elias had never spoken of such a thing before. But before anyone could ask, he turned and shuffled back to his cottage, leaving behind a silence thick with curiosity and suspicion. The next morning, the village was abuzz with whispers. Some claimed Elias had hidden a fortune in gold and jewels, stolen from a caravan years ago. Others believed it was something far more valuable, an ancient relic, perhaps, or a map to a forgotten kingdom. Whatever it was, the idea of treasure ignited a spark of greed in the hearts of the villagers. But Elias was no fool. He knew the power of a well-placed rumor, and he used it to his advantage. Over the next few days, he began to spread tales of strangers lurking in the forest, of shadows moving in the night, of attempts to break into his cottage. The villagers, already on edge, began to turn on each other. Suspicion grew like a weed, choking the bonds of trust that had once held the community together. One by one, the villagers began to spy on their neighbors, convinced that someone among them was plotting to steal the treasure. Doors were locked, windows barred, and accusations flew like arrows. The blacksmith accused the shepherd of sneaking around his property at night. The baker's wife claimed she saw the miller digging near the old oak tree. Even children were not spared, their innocent game seen as cover for something more sinister. Amid the chaos, Elias remained in his cottage, a faint smile playing on his lips. He watched as the villagers tore each other apart, their greed and mistrust blinding them to the truth. For Elias had no treasure, not in the way they imagined. His true wealth lay in their weakness, their desperation, their willingness to believe in something that didn't exist. And as the days turned to weeks, Elias began to make his move. One by one, he approached the villagers, offering them deals they couldn't refuse. To the blacksmith, he promised protection from the thieves in exchange for a portion of his earnings. To the shepherd, he offered a map to the treasure in exchange for his flock. To the baker, he sold a charm to ward off evil spirits, taking her savings in return. The villagers, too, consumed by their own greed and fear, didn't notice the pattern. They didn't see how Elias was stripping them of their possessions, their land, their dignity. They didn't realize that the treasure they sought was nothing more than a mirage, a trick of the light. But as the old man's schemes unfolded, strange things began to happen in the village. Shadows seemed to move on their own. Whispers echoed in the wind, and the air grew heavy with an unshakable sense of dread. The villagers, already on edge, began to wonder if Elias's treasure was cursed, or if the old man himself was something far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. And then, one morning, Elias was gone. His cottage stood empty, the door hanging open like a gaping wound. Inside, there was no sign of the old man, no hint of the treasure he had so carefully guarded. All that remained was a single note, scrawled in shaky handwriting. The treasure was never mine to keep. The villagers were left with nothing but their regrets and the chilling realization that they had been played. But as they gathered in the square, their faces pale and their hands trembling, they couldn't shake the feeling that Elias's presence still lingered, that his shadow still loomed over Black Hollow, waiting to strike once more. And in the forest beyond the village, a faint light flickered, as if something or someone was watching. The disappearance of Elias Thorne left Black Hollow in a state of uneasy silence. The villagers, once consumed by greed and suspicion, now wandered the streets like ghosts, their faces hollow and their eyes haunted. The treasure they had fought over was nowhere to be found, and the deals they had made with Elias had left them poor, both in wealth and spirit. But the old man's absence did not bring peace. If anything, the village felt heavier, as if the air itself had thickened with dread. Strange occurrences began to plague Black Hollow, small at first, but growing more unsettling with each passing day. It started with the shadows. Children playing near the forest's edge swore they saw figures moving among the trees, tall, slender shapes that vanished when approached. Farmers working in their fields reported hearing whispers carried on the wind, though no one was there. At night, the villagers locked their doors and huddled by their hearths, jumping at every creak and groan of their homes. The blacksmith, a burly man named Garrett, was the first to voice what everyone was thinking. "It's him," he muttered one evening at the tavern, his hands trembling around his mug of ale. "Elias. He's not gone. He's still here, watching us." The others nodded in grim agreement, but no one dared to say more. The thought of Elias lingering in the shadows, his sharp eyes observing their every move, was too terrifying to put into words. As the days turned into weeks, the strange phenomena grew more pronounced. Livestock went missing, their pens left undisturbed but empty. Crops withered overnight, their roots blackened as if poisoned. And then there were the dreams, vivid, horrifying visions that left the villagers gasping for air in the dead of night. In these dreams, They saw Elias standing at the edge of a dark forest, his frail form silhouetted against a blood-red moon. He would beckon to them, his voice a whisper that echoed in their minds. "Come. The treasure is waiting." Those who followed him in their dreams woke screaming, their bodies drenched in sweat and their hearts pounding. They spoke of a clearing in the forest, of a gaping hole in the ground that seemed to stretch into infinity. And at the bottom of that hole, they said, was the treasure, a glimmering, pulsating light that called to them, promising wealth beyond their wildest dreams. But it was a lie. They could feel it in their bones, a deep, primal fear that warned them to stay away. Despite their terror, the villagers couldn't resist the pull of the dreams. One by one, they began to venture into the forest, driven by a compulsion they couldn't explain. They told themselves they were searching for answers, for closure, but deep down, they knew the truth. They were still chasing the treasure, still hoping to find what Elias had promised. Garrett was the first to go. Armed with a lantern and a rusty axe, he disappeared into the forest one moonless night, his face pale but determined. He didn't return. The baker's wife followed, her apron still dusted with flour as she stumbled into the trees, muttering about the light. She, too, vanished without a trace. Soon, the forest became a place of nightmares, its dark canopy swallowing anyone who dared to enter. The villagers who remained behind watched in horror as their friends and neighbors were consumed by the shadows, their screams echoing through the night before fading into silence. But not everyone was willing to succumb to the forest's pull. A young woman named Lila, the daughter of the village's late healer, refused to believe in Elias's treasure. She had always been skeptical of the old man, her sharp mind seeing through his lies, where others had been blinded by greed. Now, as the village crumbled around her, she vowed to uncover the truth. Lila spent her days poring over her mother's old journals, searching for any mention of Elias or the forest. Her mother had been the only one in the village who had openly distrusted the old man, and Lila was certain she had left behind clues. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows lengthened, Lila found what she was looking for. Tucked between the pages of a worn journal was a map, a crude drawing of the forest, marked with strange symbols and a single ominous X. Her heart racing, Lila studied the map, her fingers tracing the lines and curves. The X was located deep in the forest, in a place no villager had ever dared to go. It was said to be cursed, a place where the trees grew twisted and the air was thick with the stench of decay. But Lila had no choice. If there was any hope of saving her village, she would have to face the forest's darkness head-on. Gathering her courage, she packed a small bag with supplies, a knife, a lantern, and a pouch of herbs her mother had once used to ward off evil spirits. As she stepped into the forest, the trees seemed to close in around her, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The deeper she went, the more the forest seemed to come alive. Strange sounds echoed around her whispers, laughter, the rustle of unseen creatures. The air grew colder, and the ground beneath her feet became soft and spongy, as if she were walking on something other than soil. Finally, after what felt like hours, Lila reached the clearing marked on the map. It was just as the villagers had described in their dreams, a gaping hole in the ground, its edges jagged and uneven. And at the bottom, faint but unmistakable, was a light, a pale, sickly glow that pulsed like a heartbeat. Lila's breath caught in her throat. She could feel the pull of the light, a magnetic force that tugged at her very soul. It whispered to her, promising answers, power, freedom from fear. But she resisted. Clutching the pouch of herbs, she took a step back, her mind racing. This was no treasure. This was something far more dangerous. Something Elias had used to manipulate the villagers, to feed on their greed and fear. And then she saw him. Elias Thorne stood at the edge of the hole, his frail form silhouetted against the light. He turned to her, his blue eyes gleaming with a mixture of amusement and malice. "You're too late," he said, his voice echoing in the stillness. "The treasure was never mine to keep. It belongs to them." Lila followed his gaze to the hole, her blood turning to ice. The light was growing brighter, its pulse quickening. And within it, she could see shapes, human shapes, writhing and twisting as if trapped. The villagers. Garrett, the baker's wife, the others who had disappeared, they were all there. Their faces contorted in agony as the light consumed them. Lila stumbled back, her mind reeling. This was no treasure. It was a trap, a prison for the souls of the greedy and the desperate. And Elias was its keeper. The old man smiled, his teeth gleaming in the darkness. "You could join them," he said, his voice dripping with false kindness. "Or you could run. But know this, the forest never lets go." Lila didn't wait to hear more. She turned and fled, her heart pounding as the forest closed in around her. Behind her, she could hear Elias's laughter, a sound that would haunt her for the rest of her days. When she finally emerged from the forest, gasping for breath and covered in sweat, the village was silent. The remaining villagers stared at her with hollow eyes, their faces pale and drawn. Lila knew then that the nightmare was far from over. Elias's shadow still loomed over Black Hollow, and the forest's darkness was spreading. But she also knew one thing: she would not let it win. Lila's return to the village was met with silence. The remaining villagers, those who had resisted the forest's pull, gathered around her, their faces gaunt and their eyes hollow. They had seen too much, lost too much, and now they looked to her for answers. But Lila had no comfort to offer. Her hands trembled as she recounted what she had seen in the forest: the gaping hole, the pulsating light, the trapped souls of their friends and neighbors. And Elias, always Elias, standing at the edge of it all, his smile sharp and his eyes gleaming with malice. The villagers listened in stunned silence, their fear palpable. When Lila finished, the blacksmith's wife, a stout woman named Marta, was the first to speak. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling. "How do we stop him?" Lila hesitated. She had no plan, no weapon to fight the darkness that had consumed their village. But she knew one thing: they couldn't stay here. The forest was alive, and it was hungry. "We leave," she said, her voice firm despite the fear gnawing at her chest. "We gather what we can and go. There's nothing left for us here." The villagers murmured among themselves, their faces etched with doubt. Black Hollow was their home, the only life they had ever known. But as they looked toward the forest, its dark canopy looming like a predator, they knew Lila was right. The exodus began at dawn. The villagers packed their meager belongings, clothes, tools, whatever food they could salvage, and formed a ragged line at the edge of the village. Lila led the way, her heart heavy but resolute. She didn't look back as they left the crumbling cottages and barren fields behind, but she could feel the forest's presence, a cold weight pressing against her spine. For a time, it seemed they might escape. The road out of Black Hollow was narrow and overgrown, but the villagers pressed on, their footsteps quick and their eyes fixed on the horizon. The forest thinned around them, the trees growing sparser and the air lighter. But then, as the sun began to set, they heard it, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The villagers froze, their eyes darting to the shadows. "Keep moving," Lila urged, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her throat. "Don't stop." They quickened their pace, but the growl grew louder, more insistent. And then from the trees emerged the shadows, tall, slender figures with glowing eyes and twisted limbs. They moved with unnatural speed, their forms flickering like smoke as they closed in on the villagers. Panic erupted. The villagers screamed and scattered, their belongings abandoned as they ran for their lives. Lila tried to keep them together, shouting for them to stay close, but it was no use. The shadows were everywhere, their whispers filling the air like a chorus of nightmares. One by one, the villagers fell. Some were dragged into the trees, their screams cut short. Others simply vanished, swallowed by the darkness. Lila ran, her lungs burning and her legs aching, but the shadows were relentless. Finally, she stumbled into a clearing, her body collapsing to the ground. She looked up, her breath catching in her throat. Elias stood before her, his frail form silhouetted against the fading light. His smile was the same as always, sharp, knowing, and utterly devoid of mercy. "You should," he said, his voice soft but carrying an edge of menace. "The forest doesn't like to let go." Lila scrambled to her feet, her hand clutching the pouch of herbs her mother had left her. She didn't know if it would work, but it was all she had. "What do you want?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "Why are you doing this?" Elias tilted his head, his blue eyes glinting with amusement. "I told you before," he said. "The treasure was never mine to keep. It belongs to them." He gestured to the shadows, which had gathered at the edge of the clearing. Lila's heart sank as she realized the truth. The shadows were the villagers who had disappeared, their souls twisted and corrupted by the forest's darkness. "You're a monster," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Elias chuckled, a sound that sent shivers down her spine. "No, my dear," he said. "I'm just a man. The real monster is the forest and the greed that feeds it." Lila's mind raced. She had to do something, anything, to stop him. But before she could act, Elias stepped forward, his hand outstretched. "Join us," he said, his voice a hypnotic whisper. "The treasure is waiting." Lila felt the pull, a magnetic force that threatened to overwhelm her. She clutched the pouch of herbs tighter, her fingers trembling as she opened it. "No," she said, her voice firm despite the fear coursing through her veins. "I won't let you win." She threw the herbs into the air, their pungent scent filling the clearing. The shadows recoiled, their forms flickering and distorting. Elias's smile faltered, his eyes narrowing in anger. "You think that will stop me?" he snarled, his voice rising to a roar. "You think you can escape?" Lila didn't answer. She turned and ran, her legs carrying her through the forest as the shadows closed in behind her. She didn't know if she would make it, if she could outrun the darkness. But she had to try. As she burst out of the forest and into the open, the sun broke through the clouds, its golden light bathing the land in warmth. Lila collapsed to her knees, her body trembling with exhaustion. Behind her, the forest was silent, its dark canopy still and lifeless. But Lila knew the truth. The darkness was still there, waiting. And Elias was still watching. Lila never returned to Black Hollow. She wandered the land, carrying the weight of her village's tragedy with her. She told her story to anyone who would listen, warning them of the dangers of greed and the darkness that lurked in the hearts of men. But the forest remained, its shadows growing deeper and its whispers louder. And in the heart of it, Elias Thorne stood, his smile sharp and his eyes gleaming with malice. The treasure was weight,